Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in metaphysics. We're continuing talking about the subject of ontology in this video, continuing talking about specifically the idea of ontology as developed by philosopher Quine in ontology, and some of the implications that are had in relation to the development of an ontological series of theories of ontological commitments that lead us down a path where we're starting to talk about various different subsidiary issues in relation to the metaphysics of ontology. Okay, the previous lesson really went into a lot of detail examining the Quinean understanding of ontology. Quine famously wrote a paper titled "On What Exists," and essentially we talk about the method by which Quine addresses some of the major ontological questions, some of the major, what some may consider to be paradoxical elements of ontology. So, for example, how can we show that statements where we are, or propositions where we are suggesting the existence of non-existent objects having some kind of value? And we use the example, the thought experiment of the proposition Santa does not exist, which is almost very paradoxical in a way, because on the one hand, it's a true statement in the sense that Santa does not exist, but on the other hand, if it is true, then it must have some kind of meaning, and it therefore must have some kind of value attached to it. But if we're talking about assigning meaning to a statement which is the truth statement of something that does not exist. We get into some of the ways in which Quine addresses these issues in that previous lesson. This lesson is going to just recap the position by Quine, look at the concept of existence, and then look at the philosophical distinction that exists when we look at the ideas relating to philosophical identity. And that's essentially what we're going to do in this video. So as a basic recap on the concept of non-existent objects, if we look back to the end of the previous lesson, what we did was drew a distinction between the concept of being and the concept of existence. And what we did was we used logic to do so. We used the language of first order logic to make this distinction very, very clear. We used the example in first order logic of the existential quantifier of some kind of variable to suggest that it means that there is some existence of something that is x. Now we use x as a simple placeholder because it is simply representative of a variable, but we're talking here about the existence of something. That's what the existential quantifier does in first order logic. It can be translated in a couple of ways, should I say. There exists some x, or there is an x that, and then you would, in addition to the existential quantifier attached to a variable, you would probably have further indications of how this logic actually pertains and relates to other to other predicates, to other relations, all these different things here. This isn't a first order logic video, but that's the basic standard of first order logic that we have explored previously. Now, if we want to take this from first order logic and then just reformulate it into something of a philosophical argument that is presented in English, we can look to the metaphysician and philosopher Peter Inwagen, Van Inwagen, should I say, who really looks at this concept and definition of existence. Okay. And what he does in this definition is postulate 5 basic theses that relates to the concept of existence. We're going to look at 4 of these 5 different theses in this video, the 4 being the most important ones. And these are described here as the theses of existence. And he outlines these 4 elements, okay? So he suggests, firstly, that being, okay, is not an activity. What does this mean? Well, he's suggesting here that the concept of being is not something that is a thing that something that is being does. Okay, it is something that is an attributable characteristic of a thing. It is not an activity that the thing does. The second postulate is that being is the same as existence. So there isn't a distinction that is drawn between the idea of being and the idea of existing. The idea of being is the same as the idea of existence. If you are doing one, you are also doing the other. Or let's just say, if you're doing one, that implies it could be an activity. If you have the characteristic of existence, then you have the characteristic of being. The third element is that the idea that existence is univocal, okay? And the idea here that we are presenting here is in conjunction with the previous elements, okay? And when we think of the final one here, we can really start to get this argument and get these postulates that have been presented by Inwagen and translate them back into the first order logic that we were looking at previously. He says that the single sense of being or existence, so the idea that being and existence are essentially the same thing, and that being and existence are not activities, they are characteristics, if you will, you can adequately capture and you can adequately explain the nature of being or the nature of existence in the existential quantifier within first order logic, which we looked at in the previous slide, i.e. the reverse little e that we see here that says there is some x, there exists some x. So with that being said, let's just draw our attention to the next major issue, which is this idea of philosophical identity. Okay, it is important that we discuss issues of identity, because when we talk about identity in the context of metaphysics, this will come out of a number of different issues. Okay, this will crop up at multiple other points within our lessons. In fact, there may even be lessons that we do in the future where we spend some time looking specifically at philosophical identity. So, in fact, like I said, the study of identity is an examination of metaphysics in and of itself. So it is a topic of metaphysics that we could do alongside the likes of the philosophy of time, or the likes of the philosophy of ontology, modality, causation, persistence, etc., or free will even. We often have to draw a distinction in philosophy between what we would describe as qualitative identity, which is the weaker form of identity, versus numerical identity, which is the strongest form of philosophical identity. When we say that two things are metaphysically identical, when we talk about identity essentially within the broader context of philosophy and the broader context of metaphysics, okay, we are referring to numerical identity. If we say that A equals B and that A and B are metaphysically identical, we are saying that they are numerically identical. This essentially tells us that A and B are one in the same, okay? They don't share qualitative features or characteristics in the sense that they're two different things that maybe look similar or maybe behave in similar ways. They are numerically identical in the sense that they are literally one in the same thing. You may have two different names for the same object. So, for example, the idea that the North Star and Venus, okay, are numerically identical. The reason why is because in language we are referring to two different things technically, or at least we're making two different statements in language, but in reality we are talking about the exact same thing, the thing in the sky that is both the North Star and the planet Venus. They just happen to be the same thing with two different names. That's what numerical identity tells us. So essentially what we have here are two different entities, but they may both represent the same thing. The two different entities may be the two different ways in which we can name said entities, but they're both representing the same thing. When we talk about identity in relation to common parlance, however, and the sort of colloquial understanding of identity, we are often referring to something known as qualitative identity. This is a weaker definition. This accepts that the view that A and B may refer to two distinct things, but that these two things share a commonality. They share an identity in the fact that they are qualitatively similar. They share similar qualities. This would be the case if you had, for example, two pens that are identical to each other. Okay, there are two pens. I've got two pens in my hand. They both come from the same packet of ballpoint pens that I bought a few months ago. Okay, so they are both of the same design. You could not tell them apart. Okay, but they are only qualitatively similar because they are still two distinct things. I can hold one in one hand. I can hold one in the other hand. One can exist in this plane of existence over here in this space. The other can exist in a different space over here. Okay, they're not numerically identical. They're not one and the same. They're still two distinct things despite having the same qualities, being qualitatively the same. Another example is that, in a weaker instance, is that if I have a Ford Focus which is green and I have another one which is also green, we would say that these are two Ford Focuses which are green. But they're not numerically identical. They're not numerically identical in the sense that they are one in the same car. We're saying that they share similar qualities. They have the quality of being a car that we would classify as being a Ford Focus, the characteristics of a Ford Focus, and also the characteristics of the color, the characteristics of greenness that is attributable to both of these. But they're still different. They're still different cars. They are just qualitatively identical. So it's important that we just take a brief minute to think about that, and when we get into looking at metaphysics in future lessons time, I will refer back to these concepts of identity and refer back to these concepts of ontology and all of these different ideas, because when we get into looking at other areas in metaphysics, these things start to crop up again. And that's one of the things that is important about metaphysics, is that they're often not distinct subtopics. For example, ontology will be shown to exist and be shown to have very important implications in all of the other branches of metaphysics, in a lot of different branches of philosophy more generally.